The crisp morning air carried a faint scent of pine and ash, the hallmark of Pinewood, a small town nestled deep in the mountains. Harold Emerson, a 93-year-old retired fire chief, stood on his porch sipping black coffee from a chipped mug. The quiet was comforting, a companion he had grown to cherish in his twilight years. Yet, the serenity of Pinewood masked the brewing storm. It began with the rumble of motorcycles slicing through the morning calm. Harold watched as a dozen leather-clad bikers roared down Main Street, their laughter echoing off the storefronts. The Iron Fangs, the new scourge of the town, had arrived. Harold narrowed his eyes. He knew trouble when he saw it. These weren't weekend riders. The Iron Fangs had a reputation. Extortion, theft, and violence trailed them like shadows. Harold had heard the whispers around town. The Iron Fangs were pressing shop owners for protection money, preying on the vulnerable. Pinewood was on the brink, and its residents were too afraid to stand up. As Harold set his mug down, he noticed Mrs. Reynolds, the elderly baker, being cornered outside her shop by two bikers. Her frail frame seemed to shrink under their intimidation. The sight stoked an old fire within Harold, a fire he thought had long been extinguished. Harold shuffled to his phone, fingers trembling, and called the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Burns speaking," came the gruff voice on the other end. "We've got a problem," Harold said, his tone steady despite his rising anger. "Those bikers are harassing Mrs. Reynolds." A heavy sigh followed. "I'll see what I can do, Harold, but you know how things are. My hands are tied." Harold clenched his jaw. He had always respected Burns, but it was clear the sheriff was outnumbered and overwhelmed. The Iron Fangs operated with impunity, and the authorities had little power to stop them. Later that afternoon, Harold visited the bakery. Mrs. Reynolds looked shaken, but grateful. "Thank you for calling the sheriff, Harold," she said, her voice trembling as she handed him a loaf of bread. "They didn't take much, just enough to remind me who's in charge." Harold grunted. "They're not in charge, not while I'm still breathing." As he walked back home, Harold felt the weight of the town's collective fear pressing down on him. Memories of his days in the fire department surfaced, of standing shoulder to shoulder with his crew, braving infernos to protect what mattered. His gut told him this was no different. Pinewood needed someone to fight for it. That evening, Harold sat in his small living room, the crackling fireplace casting flickering shadows across the walls. He stared at an old photograph on the mantel, himself as a young man, standing proudly with his firefighting crew. The image stirred something in him. He opened a dusty cabinet and pulled out a worn, leather-bound journal. It was filled with tactics and notes he had accumulated over decades of service. Harold wasn't just a firefighter, he was a tactician. He had led his crew through life-threatening situations, using strategy and grit to save lives. A determined glint returned to his eyes as he flipped through the pages. This wasn't just his fight, it was the town's fight, and Pinewood wouldn't go down without resistance. The next morning, Harold ventured to the diner, the unofficial heart of Pinewood. The usual crowd was there, shopkeepers, farmers, and young Robbie, the boy who always dreamed of being a firefighter like Harold. Harold cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "We all know why the Iron Fangs are here," he began, his voice firm. "They think we're easy prey, but we've faced worse before. This town survived wildfires, floods, and winters that nearly froze us solid. We can handle this." Murmurs spread across the room. Robbie leaned forward, eyes wide with admiration. "What are you saying, Chief?" asked Jim, the hardware store owner. "I'm saying it's time to fight back," Harold declared. "We know this town better than they do. We've got the people, the tools, and the heart. We just need the courage." For a moment, there was silence. Then, one by one, heads began to nod. Hope kindled in their eyes, replacing the fear that had taken root. As Harold left the diner, he noticed a biker lounging against his truck. The man smirked, his tattooed arms folded. "Old man," he sneered, "you'd better stay out of this. Pinewood belongs to us now." Harold stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "Son, I've faced flames that would make you cry. If you think I'm scared of a few motorcycles, you're sorely mistaken." The biker's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "You've been warned." Harold watched him ride off, his resolve hardening. The fight for Pinewood had begun, and Harold Emerson was ready to lead it. Little did the Iron Fangs know, they had underestimated the retired fire chief. Harold wasn't just a relic of the past. He was Pinewood's last line of defense, and he wasn't going down without a fight. As Harold returned home, a brick crashed through his window, wrapped in a note. "Stay out of this, or burn." Would Harold heed the warning, or would he strike back harder? Pinewood's fate rested on his shoulders. Harold stared at the broken glass littering his living room floor, the ominous note lying among the shards. The words, "Stay out of this, or burn," were scrawled in jagged letters, their intent clear. But instead of fear, a sense of determination washed over him. Harold Emerson wasn't a man to back down, not now, not ever. He picked up the note, his fingers steady. He knew the Iron Fangs wouldn't stop at intimidation. They thrived on fear, and if no one stood up to them, Pinewood would crumble under their grip. Harold tightened his jaw. They had made a mistake by underestimating him. The next morning, Harold set out to rally the town. He stopped by the hardware store first, where Jim was unpacking crates. Jim looked up as Harold entered, his face weary. "Jim, we need to act," Harold said without preamble. "They're not just going to go away. If we don't push back, they'll take everything." Jim sighed, glancing at the floor. "Harold, you know as well as I do that most folks here are scared. They've got families. They can't risk making things worse. And what happens when the Iron Fangs decide it's not enough? When they start taking more? We've seen this before. Bullies only stop when they're forced to." Harold replied, his voice firm. Jim hesitated, then nodded. "All right. What do you have in mind?" By noon, Harold had gathered a small group of residents at the old firehouse, a place he hadn't stepped into in years. Dust clung to the walls, and the air smelled faintly of charred wood, a reminder of its history. He looked around at the faces staring back at him. Jim, Mrs. Reynolds, young Robbie, and a handful of others. "We don't have the numbers they do, but we've got something better. Strategy," Harold began, pacing in front of them. "We know this town. Every alley, every shortcut, every blind spot. We're going to use that to our advantage." "What about weapons?" someone asked. Harold shook his head. "This isn't about violence. It's about outsmarting them. The Iron Fangs think they're invincible, but they're just men, and men make mistakes." He spread out a map of Pinewood on the table, marking key points with a pencil. "We'll start by cutting off their resources. They rely on fear to control us, but what happens when we stop feeding that fear?" The group leaned in, their skepticism giving way to cautious hope. That evening, Harold set the first part of his plan in motion. He visited Pinewood's oldest ally, the owner of the town's only repair shop, Walter. Walter was a retired mechanic, gruff and no-nonsense. "Walter, I need your help," Harold said as he entered the cluttered garage. Walter wiped his hands on a greasy rag. "What kind of help?" Harold explained the plan, and Walter listened carefully. By the end, a slow grin spread across the mechanic's face. "I like it. They won't see it coming." The next morning, the Iron Fangs woke to find their motorcycles mysteriously out of commission. Tires were deflated, engines tampered with. It wasn't enough to cause lasting damage, but it sent a message. Pinewood wasn't going to roll over. Harold watched from his porch as the bikers fumed and cursed, their bravado shaken. It was a small victory, but a significant one. The tide was beginning to turn. That night, the bikers retaliated, vandalizing several storefronts, including Jim's hardware store. Harold helped clean up the mess, his resolve hardening with each shattered window he swept up. "This is exactly why we can't back down," he told Jim. "They're desperate to maintain control. If we hold our ground, we can push them out." As the days passed, the town rallied around Harold. Residents who had once been too afraid began to stand up. Small acts of defiance spread like wildfire. Doors were locked, payments were refused, and the Iron Fangs found themselves increasingly isolated. But the bikers weren't going down quietly. One evening, as Harold walked home, he noticed a shadowy figure lurking near his house. He approached cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out. The figure stepped into the light. It was a young biker, no older than Robbie, with fear in his eyes. "I'm not here to hurt you," the boy said quickly. I need help." Harold frowned. "Help? From me?" The boy nodded. "I didn't sign up for this. I thought the Iron Fangs were about freedom, but they're just bullies. I want out." Harold faced a choice: turn the boy away and risk pushing him back into the gang's clutches, or take him in and potentially invite the bikers' wrath. The stakes had just gotten higher, and Harold knew the next move could make or break their fight. Harold studied the young biker standing before him. His leather jacket bore the Iron Fangs emblem, but his eyes told a different story, a mix of fear, regret, and desperation. "Why should I trust you?" Harold asked, his tone sharp. The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. "Because I've seen what they're planning, and if you don't stop them, it's not just this town that'll suffer." Harold's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "They're planning to escalate. They're tired of your resistance, so they're bringing in reinforcements from other chapters. They're going to make an example out of Pinewood." Harold's heart sank at the revelation. The Iron Fangs weren't just bullies, they were part of a much larger network. If reinforcements arrived, Pinewood would be overrun. But instead of panic, Harold felt a surge of determination. This boy might be the edge they needed. "What's your name?" Harold asked. "Tyler," the boy replied. "All right, Tyler. You want out? You'll have to prove it. Start talking." Tyler spilled everything he knew: the gang's routines, their weak points, and most importantly, the timetable for the reinforcements' arrival. Harold listened carefully, his mind racing. This wasn't just about defending Pinewood anymore. They had to take the fight to the Iron Fangs before it was too late. The next morning, Harold gathered his growing band of allies at the firehouse. Tyler stood at the edge of the room, visibly uncomfortable under the wary gazes of the townsfolk. "This is Tyler," Harold announced. "He's taking a risk by coming to us, and he's given us critical information. Thanks to him, we know reinforcements are coming in 3 days. If we don't act now, Pinewood will fall." Jim crossed his arms. "How do we know he's not leading us into a trap?" Harold glanced at Tyler, then back at the group. "We don't. But if he's telling the truth, we can't afford to waste this opportunity." Over the next 2 days, the town mobilized like never before. Walter reinforced barricades, while Mrs. Reynolds coordinated supplies. Tyler guided them on the Iron Fang's blind spots and vulnerabilities. But tension simmered beneath the surface. Some residents still distrusted Tyler, while others doubted their ability to stand up to the gang. Harold worked tirelessly to keep spirits high, reminding them of what was at stake. On the eve of the bikers' reinforcements' arrival, Harold called a final meeting. "We've done everything we can to prepare," he said, his voice steady. "Tomorrow, we'll send the Iron Fangs a message they won't forget. But remember, this isn't just about us. It's about proving that no one, not even them, can take away our dignity and freedom." The room erupted in applause, the air thick with resolve. That night, as Harold patrolled the town, Tyler approached him. "I want to help in the fight," Tyler said. Harold shook his head. "You've already done enough." "No," Tyler insisted. "I need to make this right. I need to prove to myself that I'm not like them." Harold saw the determination in Tyler's eyes and nodded. "All right, but stay close. We can't afford to lose anyone." The next morning, Pinewood braced itself. The townsfolk were stationed at key points, armed with everything from makeshift barricades to buckets of water for potential fires. Walter had rigged several traps to slow the bikers down, while Jim and Robbie kept watch from a rooftop. As the sound of roaring engines filled the air, Harold felt a chill run down his spine. The Iron Fangs were coming, and this time they weren't holding back. The first wave of bikers arrived with an air of arrogance, their reinforcements trailing behind in a convoy. They expected the same frightened townsfolk they had bullied for months. What they found instead was a coordinated resistance. The traps triggered perfectly, throwing the bikers into disarray. The townsfolk held their ground, using the terrain to their advantage. Even Tyler played his part. leading a group to cut off the bikers' retreat. But the fight was far from over. As the gang regrouped, their leader, a hulking man named Bear, stepped forward. He bellowed a challenge, his voice echoing through the town. "Harold Emerson, come out and face me!" Harold stepped forward, his heart pounding. Bear towered over him, but Harold stood tall, his voice firm. "This is our town, Bear. You don't belong here." Bear laughed, a deep, menacing sound. "You think these people can stop us? You're just delaying the inevitable." Harold's gaze didn't waver. "Maybe, but I'd rather stand and fight than live on my knees." As Bear charged toward Harold, the townsfolk braced for the fight of their lives. The outcome hung in the balance, and Harold knew this confrontation would determine not just Pinewood's future, but the spirit of resistance itself. Bear's charge was like a freight train barreling down the tracks. The ground trembled beneath his massive boots, and his roar filled the air, a chilling declaration of dominance. Harold stood his ground, gripping the wooden handle of a fire axe with white-knuckled determination. The townsfolk watched, frozen, as the retired fire chief faced off against the behemoth biker leader. This wasn't just a fight, it was a battle of wills, a clash of ideals. Bear swung first, a haymaker meant to crush Harold in one blow. Harold ducked just in time, the rush of air from Bear's fist grazing his cheek. Harold countered with a sharp swing of the axe handle, striking Bear's ribs. The biker grunted, but barely flinched. Meanwhile, the rest of the Iron Fangs were rallying to charge back into the fray. But Pinewood's traps, led by Walter's ingenuity, were far from exhausted. As bikers tried to cross the main street, hidden boards filled with nails punctured their tires, sending bikes skidding out of control. In another alley, Robbie and Jim unleashed buckets of slippery oil, causing bikers to lose their footing. The townsfolk seized every advantage, refusing to back down despite the odds. Bear lunged at Harold again, this time grabbing him by the shoulder and lifting him off the ground like a rag doll. Harold struggled, swinging his legs, and managed to bring the axe handle crashing down on Bear's wrist. The biker let out a growl of pain, dropping Harold to the ground. "You've got guts, old man," Bear snarled, "but guts won't save you." Harold caught his breath, backing away to gain some distance. "Maybe not, but this town will." From the corner of his eye, Harold saw Tyler leading a small group of townsfolk to flank the bikers. Using the element of surprise, they struck swiftly, pulling down makeshift barriers to trap several bikers in an alley. Tyler faced off against one of his former comrades, a sneering man named Snake. Snake smirked as he circled Tyler. "You've got a death wish, kid." Tyler's hands shook, but he held his ground. "No, I've just finally figured out who I am." Back in the square, Harold and Bear's battle raged on. Bear swung a heavy chain he'd grabbed from his belt, each strike creating a deafening crack. Harold ducked and weaved, narrowly avoiding the deadly weapon, but he was tiring, his breaths coming in sharp gasps. Bear sensed his advantage and taunted Harold. "You're too old for this fight. Just give up." Harold's eyes blazed with defiance. "If I give up, you win, and I'd rather die standing than live under your thumb." Bear charged again, swinging the chain in a wide arc. Harold sidestepped at the last moment, the chain missing him by inches and slamming into a wooden post. The post cracked, and Harold seized his chance. With a surge of adrenaline, he swung the axe handle hard, catching Bear across the knee. The massive biker roared in pain, dropping to one knee. Harold didn't hesitate, using the moment to press his advantage. He slammed the axe handle down on Bear's shoulder, forcing him to the ground. As Bear lay there struggling to rise, Harold stood over him, breathing heavily. "This is your last chance, Bear. Take your men and leave." Bear glared at Harold, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. For a moment, it seemed he might refuse. Then, the sound of a police siren pierced the air. Harold's mysterious phone call had worked. As the Iron Fangs turned to see a convoy of police cars rolling into Pinewood, their morale shattered. Several bikers tried to flee, only to be intercepted by Tyler's group or ensnared in the town's traps. Bear spat at the ground, his pride wounded. "This isn't over, old man." Harold stared him down. "It is for now." The police rounded up the bikers, arresting Bear and his men. The townsfolk cheered, their victory hard-earned but worth every sacrifice. Harold leaned on the axe handle, exhaustion finally catching up to him. Tyler approached, his face bruised but triumphant. "We did it." Harold placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "You did good, kid. You've got a future here if you want it." As the dust settled, Pinewood began to rebuild, stronger and more united than ever. But Harold couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Iron Fangs might be gone for now, but their shadow loomed large. For Harold and Pinewood, the fight for freedom and dignity would always continue. The morning after the battle, Pinewood awoke to a rare silence. For the first time in months, there was no rumble of motorcycles, no aggressive shouting, no fear in the air. The townsfolk gathered in the square, their faces a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and quiet pride. Harold stood near the old firehouse, leaning against the doorway with his hands in his pockets. His body ached in ways it hadn't in years, but the sight of Pinewood's people coming together made every bruise worthwhile. Tyler approached Harold, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing one over. Harold accepted it with a nod. "Thanks, kid. How are you holding up?" Tyler chuckled, though it sounded forced. "Better than I thought. Didn't think I had it in me." Harold looked at him thoughtfully. "Most people don't until they're tested. You proved something last night, not just to the town, but to yourself." Tyler took a sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. "I didn't just fight for Pinewood. I fought to prove I'm not like them, the Iron Fangs." "You're not," Harold said firmly, "and you've got a chance to build something different now." Nearby, Walter and a group of volunteers were dismantling the traps they'd set up for the bikers. One by one, boards with nails, tripwires, and other makeshift devices were being cleared away. Walter wiped his brow and approached Harold. "Looks like we won't need these for a while," Walter said with a weary grin. Harold smirked. "Let's hope not. But keep a few in storage, just in case." Walter's grin faded. "You really think they'll come back?" Harold's expression hardened. "Men like Bear don't take defeat lightly. They might regroup, maybe not tomorrow, but someday." As the day wore on, Pinewood slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Businesses reopened, children played in the streets, and laughter replaced the tension that had gripped the town for so long. But Harold couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was only temporary. That evening, the townsfolk gathered in the square for a celebration. Someone had set up tables with food, and a local band played lively tunes. It was a chance for the community to honor their resilience and the sacrifices made to protect Pinewood. Harold found himself at the center of it all, though he would have preferred the shadows. People approached him with handshakes, pats on the back, and a heartfelt thanks. "You saved us, Harold," one elderly woman said, tears in her eyes. "We owe you everything." Harold shook his head. "You don't owe me a thing. This town stood together. That's what saved us." As the celebration continued, Harold noticed Tyler sitting alone on the edge of the square, staring into the firelight. Harold grabbed 2 plates of food and joined him. "Not enjoying the party?" Harold asked, handing Tyler a plate. Tyler shrugged. "It's not that, just thinking." "About what?" "About what's next," Tyler admitted. "For the town. For me." Harold studied the young man for a moment. "What do you want to do?" Tyler hesitated, then said, "I want to stay, help rebuild, maybe even do some good for once." Harold smiled. "That's a start. But don't just stay because you feel guilty or obligated. Stay because you believe in this place." Tyler nodded slowly. "I think I do." Later that night, as the town quieted down, Harold returned to his small home at the edge of Pinewood. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat on the porch gazing out at the darkened streets. He should have felt victorious, but unease gnawed at him. He thought about Bear's final words. This isn't over. Harold knew Bear's kind all too well. They thrived on power and control, and they didn't take losses lightly. Even with the bikers in custody, Harold had no illusions that this was the last Pinewood would hear of the Iron Fangs. As he sat there, Harold's phone buzzed on the table beside him. He picked it up and frowned at the unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. "Harold speaking." A deep, gravelly voice came through the line. "You think you've won, old man? This is far from over." Harold's grip on the phone tightened. "Bear?" "You'll see," Bear growled. "Enjoy your little victory while it lasts. We'll be back, and this time there won't be anyone left to save Pinewood." The line went dead. Harold leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but if the Iron Fangs thought they could break him, they were in for a rude awakening. Pinewood had faced the storm once and stood tall. They would do it again, no matter what came next. Harold drained his whiskey and stared into the darkness. "Let's see what you've got, Bear." The following morning, Harold's sense of unease deepened. Bear's ominous call replayed in his mind like a broken record. The words had been clear. The Iron Fangs weren't done with Pinewood. He decided not to tell the townsfolk about the call, not yet. They deserved a moment of peace after the chaos they'd endured. But Harold knew he had to prepare. He started his day early, heading to the firehouse which had become his makeshift base of operations. Inside, Walter and a few others were already hard at work, organizing supplies and drafting plans for potential future threats. Walter looked up as Harold entered. "Morning, Chief. Sleep well?" Walter asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Not much," Harold admitted. "We need to talk." Walter's brow furrowed. "What's going on?" Harold hesitated, glancing at the others in the room. "Bear called me last night, said this isn't over." The room fell silent. The weight of Harold's words hit them like a freight train. Walter set down the clipboard he was holding and leaned against a table. "Do you think he's bluffing?" Walter asked. "No," Harold replied firmly. "Men like him don't bluff. He's regrouping, planning his next move, and we need to be ready." Tyler walked in just then, overhearing the tail end of the conversation. "Ready for what?" Harold turned to him. "Bear's planning to come back. I don't know when, but he will." Tyler's jaw tightened. "Then we don't wait for him. We take the fight to them." Harold shook his head. "That's exactly what he wants. He's trying to bait us into making a mistake. We hold our ground and prepare. This town is our priority." The next few days were a blur of activity. Harold and Walter mapped out a more comprehensive defense strategy, ensuring that the traps and barricades could be reassembled quickly if needed. Tyler took it upon himself to train some of the younger townsfolk in self-defense. Though most were hesitant, the fear of the Iron Fang's return motivated them. Meanwhile, Harold reached out to his old fire department contacts, hoping to gather intel on the bikers. One call stood out. A retired police officer named Frank, who had dealt with the Iron Fangs in his jurisdiction years ago. "You're dealing with a dangerous crew," Frank warned over the phone. "Bear doesn't just want revenge, he wants to send a message. He'll come back with more men and more firepower." Harold leaned against his desk, his jaw tightening. "What do you suggest?" "Document everything," Frank said. "Every threat, every move they make. If this escalates, you'll need evidence to bring the full force of the law down on them, and don't let your guard down." That night, Harold gathered the core group, Walter, Tyler, and a few other trusted townsfolk, for a meeting. The firehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with tension. "Here's the deal," Harold began, spreading out a map of Pinewood on the table. "We don't know when they'll come, but we know they will. We use this time to strengthen our defenses, train ourselves, and make sure everyone in town knows what to do if it happens again." Walter nodded. "What about the sheriff? Is he on board?" Harold hesitated. "Sheriff Benson's doing what he can, but let's face it, he's out of his depth. This is on us." As the group discussed strategies, Tyler's frustration bubbled over. "Why don't we just call in the feds or the state police? Let them handle this." Harold met his gaze, his tone calm but firm. "Because we can't count on anyone else. Pinewood is our home. No one's going to fight for it like we will." Tyler sat back, crossing his arms. He didn't like it, but he couldn't argue with Harold's logic. By the end of the meeting, everyone had their assignments. Walter would oversee the supplies and logistics, Tyler would continue training, and Harold would focus on gathering intel and keeping the town informed. As the others filed out, Walter stayed behind. "You sure about this, Chief? It feels like we're gearing up for a war." Harold sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not what I want, Walter, but it's what we have to do." That night, as Harold walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The streets were quiet, the shadows long under the streetlights. He kept his hand close to the knife he now carried at all times, his senses on high alert. When he reached his porch, he paused, scanning the street behind him. There was nothing out of the ordinary, but the unease lingered. He stepped inside, locking the door behind him. As he sat in his armchair, his phone buzzed with a text. It was an unknown number, and the message was chillingly simple. "We're closer than you think." Harold stared at the screen, his heart pounding. The battle for Pinewood wasn't just about defending the town anymore, it was personal, and Harold wasn't about to let Bear or anyone else take what they held dear. Harold leaned back, the weight of the town on his shoulders. He whispered to himself, "Let them come. We'll be ready." Harold didn't sleep that night. The ominous text played on a loop in his mind, gnawing at his already frayed nerves. Who had sent it? Was it Bear, or someone else in the Iron Fangs? Or worse, had they planted someone inside Pinewood? As the sun began to rise, Harold grabbed a fresh pot of coffee and sat back at his desk. He opened a small black notebook where he had been jotting down every detail. Each threat, every clue, all the whispers of danger that seemed to surround the town. He flipped through the pages, pausing at a hastily scribbled note about a new biker spotted in town 2 days prior. By mid-morning, Harold was back at the firehouse. Tyler and Walter were already there, finalizing preparations for the next training session. Harold pulled them aside. "We've got a problem," he said, handing Tyler his phone with the text message displayed. "This came last night." Tyler's face darkened as he read it. "That's not just a threat. It's a warning. They're already here." Walter frowned. "You think they've got someone inside? Someone feeding them information?" Harold nodded. "It's possible. We've got to tread carefully. We can't let them know we're on to them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a woman named Clara, a lifelong Pinewood resident who had taken to assisting the firehouse efforts. She carried a tray of sandwiches, her demeanor unusually tense. "What's wrong, Clara?" Harold asked, noticing the way she glanced nervously over her shoulder. "There was a man at my diner this morning," she said, her voice trembling. "He wasn't from around here. Big guy, leather jacket, patches all over it. He didn't order anything, just sat in the corner watching everyone." "Did you catch what the patches said?" Tyler asked. Clara nodded. "Iron Fangs." Harold's stomach tightened. The Iron Fangs weren't just threatening, they were scouting. He stood abruptly. "Tyler, Walter, follow me. Clara, lock your doors and keep your staff inside. If you see anything suspicious, call me immediately." The 3 men left the firehouse and headed straight to the diner. It was quiet now, but Harold's sharp eyes scanned every corner, looking for any sign that the biker might still be lurking. "Spread out," Harold ordered. "Look for anything he might have left behind." Tyler checked the tables and booths while Walter examined the exterior of the building. Harold stayed near the counter, his gaze falling on a discarded napkin with a crudely drawn symbol, a skull with crossed wrenches beneath it. He recognized it immediately as the Iron Fangs emblem. He pocketed the napkin and called Tyler and Walter back inside. "They're leaving breadcrumbs," he said, "trying to rattle us." Walter frowned. "Well, it's working." "It's a mind game," Harold said, "and we're not going to play it. Let's head back and regroup." Back at the firehouse, Harold spread out his growing collection of evidence on the table, the napkin, photos of Bear's crew from the first encounter, and the text message. Tyler leaned over the table, studying it all. "They're taunting us," Tyler said. "But why? Why not just attack outright?" "Because they're testing us," Harold replied. "They want to see how we'll react, figure out our weaknesses." Walter sighed. "So, what do we do?" Harold's expression hardened. We don't flinch. We stay the course, strengthen our defenses, and keep our eyes open. And if they come at us, we'll be ready." The following days were tense. Harold kept his phone close, waiting for another message, another clue about the Iron Fang's next move. Meanwhile, the townsfolk rallied together, inspired by Harold's resolve. The firehouse became a hub of activity, with people dropping off supplies, volunteering for patrols, and sharing any information about suspicious activity. Late one evening, while Harold was reviewing the day's reports, his phone buzzed again. It was another text from the unknown number. "Tick-tock, Chief, time's running out." Harold stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He forwarded the message to Tyler and Walter, then called them to meet him immediately. Within minutes, they were gathered in Harold's small living room. "They're escalating," Harold said, showing them the message. "We've got to assume they're planning something big." Tyler nodded. "Maybe it's time to call in reinforcements. The sheriff? Maybe even the state police." Harold shook his head. "The sheriff's stretched thin as it is, and we don't have enough to bring the state police in yet. We need more proof." Walter leaned forward. "Then we set a trap. If they're scouting, they'll keep coming back. We catch one of them, make them talk." Harold considered it. It was risky, but it might be their best shot at getting the upper hand. "All right," Harold said, "but we do this carefully. No one gets hurt, and we don't let them know we're on to them." As the group began to outline their plan, Harold couldn't shake the feeling that the Iron Fangs were always one step ahead. But he also knew that Pinewood's greatest strength wasn't just its defenses, it was its people. Together, they were stronger than any outsider could imagine. And as the clock ticked down, Harold vowed that no matter what the Iron Fangs had planned, Pinewood would stand tall. The plan was set in motion the next morning. Harold, Tyler, and Walter worked quickly but methodically, using every bit of their collective knowledge to set a trap that would lure the Iron Fangs out into the open. They decided the best location would be the old industrial yard on the edge of town, a place large enough to provide cover, but isolated enough to avoid putting Pinewood residents at risk. Tyler set up hidden cameras around the perimeter, while Walter prepared an old storage unit to look like a makeshift hideout. Harold coordinated with a few trusted locals who would act as decoys, making the yard appear as if it were being used for a secret meeting. The idea was simple. Make the Iron Fangs curious enough to investigate, then capture one of them for questioning. "This has to be precise," Harold told his team as they finalized the setup. "No guns, no unnecessary risks. We don't want anyone getting hurt." By late afternoon, everything was ready. The decoys arrived, blending seamlessly into the yard's industrial landscape. They pretended to exchange information and pass small packages while Tyler, Walter, and Harold watched from a nearby vantage point. The wait was agonizing, each minute stretching endlessly. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the distant hum of motorcycle engines broke the silence. "They're here," Walter whispered, his voice taut with tension. Through binoculars, Harold watched as 3 bikers rolled into the yard. Their leather jackets bore the unmistakable Iron Fangs emblem. They dismounted their bikes, their movements cautious as they scanned the area. One of them barked orders, clearly the leader of this small group. "Stick to the plan," Harold reminded everyone over the radio. "Let them come to us." The bikers moved closer to the storage unit, their footsteps crunching on the gravel. One of them pulled out a flashlight, sweeping the beam across the area. As they reached the unit's entrance, Tyler triggered a loud clatter from a nearby stack of metal pipes, drawing their attention. The bikers turned sharply, splitting up to investigate the noise. That's when Harold and Walter made their move. Harold stepped into the yard, his flashlight illuminating the leader's face. "That's far enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. The biker froze, his hand hovering near his belt. "Who the hell are you?" he snarled. "Someone who's not interested in playing games," Harold replied. "We know who you are and why you're here, so why don't you save us all some trouble and start talking?" The tension was palpable as the 2 other bikers appeared from the shadows, flanking their leader. Walter emerged behind Harold, his presence solid and steady. The bikers hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "You think you can intimidate us?" The leader sneered, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Harold didn't flinch. "I think you know this town isn't going to roll over for you. And if you're smart, you'll turn around and ride out before things get worse for you." One of the younger bikers, clearly nervous, muttered, "Maybe we should just go." The leader shot him a glare. "Shut up!" Harold seized the moment. "Listen to him. You're out of your depth here. Leave while you still can." The leader hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. "This isn't over," he growled. "You'll regret this." As the bikers mounted their bikes and roared away, Harold's team felt a brief wave of relief, but it was short-lived. They had won the first skirmish, but the war was far from over. Back at the firehouse, the team debriefed. Walter was frustrated. "We let them go. We could have gotten more information out of them." Harold shook his head. "They weren't going to talk, not yet. But we sent a message tonight. They know we're ready for them." Tyler chimed in. "And we've got footage from the cameras. We can analyze it, see if we missed anything." As they reviewed the footage later that night, Harold spotted something chilling. One of the bikers had slipped a small device under the decoy storage unit, a tracker. It was clear now. The Iron Fangs weren't just scouting. They were laying the groundwork for something much bigger. "We've got to stay ahead of them," Harold said, his voice resolute. "This isn't just about defending Pinewood anymore. It's about taking the fight to them." The discovery of the tracker reignited the fire in Harold's gut. He knew the Iron Fangs wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But he also knew Pinewood was stronger than the bikers realized. With every passing day, the town rallied closer together, ready to stand behind their retired fire chief. And Harold, the man who had faced countless fires in his lifetime, was determined to extinguish this threat once and for all. The Iron Fangs never saw it coming. Harold's meticulous planning, coupled with the unwavering determination of Pinewood's residents, caught the gang off guard. Over the weeks, the townspeople united like never before. Families, shopkeepers, and even the once skeptical mayor contributed to the growing resistance, driven by Harold's unrelenting resolve. The final showdown took place on a cold, moonlit night in the town square. The Iron Fangs, emboldened by their numbers, had decided to make an example of Pinewood, expecting an easy victory. What they didn't anticipate was a coordinated ambush. As the bikers rolled into town, expecting to intimidate with their roaring engines and sheer presence, they were met with barricades, searchlights, and the determined faces of the townsfolk. Harold, standing at the forefront, exuded calm authority. His voice carried over the din. "You've underestimated us for the last time." The bikers hesitated, their bravado faltering. Then, in a swift and decisive operation, Pinewood executed Harold's plan. They used non-lethal measures, overwhelming the gang with smoke bombs, blinding lights, and the element of surprise. Local authorities, backed by evidence Tyler and Walter had gathered, quickly arrested the gang's leaders. The Iron Fangs' grip on Pinewood crumbled under the weight of their own arrogance. In the aftermath, Pinewood celebrated its triumph. The firehouse became the heart of the community's resurgence. Harold, once seen as a relic of the past, became a symbol of resilience and leadership. Tyler, with his tech-savvy ingenuity, took on a mentorship role for the town's younger generation. Walter, ever loyal, became Harold's right hand, ensuring the firehouse remained a beacon of safety and hope. Months later, the town square buzzed with life during a festival organized to commemorate the victory. Children played, music filled the air, and the aroma of home-cooked meals wafted through the streets. Harold stood on a makeshift stage, addressing the crowd. "This victory wasn't mine alone," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It was ours. Pinewood stood together, and that's something no one can ever take from us." As the crowd erupted into applause, Harold's gaze drifted toward the firehouse. It stood as a reminder of his life's work, now imbued with new meaning. He realized this chapter of his life wasn't about retiring or fading away. It was about leaving behind a legacy of courage, unity, and unyielding spirit. Later that evening, Harold sat on the firehouse steps, the cool night air wrapping around him like an old friend. Tyler and Walter joined him, each holding a mug of coffee. "You really pulled it off," Walter said, his tone both admiring and teasing. Harold chuckled. "We pulled it off." Tyler raised his mug. "To Pinewood." Harold smiled, his heart full. "To Pinewood, and to never backing down." As the three men sat under the stars, Pinewood thrived in the background, a town reborn, united by one man's refusal to give in. Harold knew there would always be challenges ahead, but he also knew the strength of his town. Together, they had faced their fears and emerged stronger. And Harold, the 93-year-old retired fire chief who once fought fires, had proven that some flames never die. As the dust settled on Pinewood's streets, one thing became clear. Courage isn't bound by age, and unity is the most powerful force of all. Harold, a 93-year-old retired fire chief, reminded us that standing up for what's right can inspire change and transform a community. His determination reignited not just the spirit of a town, but the belief that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they come together. If this story inspired you, imagine what you could achieve by taking a stand in your own life. Whether it's overcoming challenges, facing fears, or fighting for what you believe in, the power to change the narrative lies within you. Now, we want to hear from you. What did you think of Harold's story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where resilience and unity made all the difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button to let us know, subscribe for more powerful stories that inspire and transform, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our next video. Until next time, remember, courage is contagious, and sometimes all it takes is one spark to light up the world.